start. So I'm going to keep my part very, very brief, but just for those of you who haven't come across me before, my name's Monica Bohm-Duchin. I'm the founding director of a project called Insiders, Outsiders, which was initially and primarily intended to pay tribute and to analyze in more depth than is usually the case, the immensely rich and pervasive contribution of refugees from Nazi persecution to this country's culture. But as indeed today's session makes evident, the remit has sort of extended slightly beyond that to look at refugees, perhaps more generally, refugees, different waves of refugees at different times as well. I'm going to be handing very shortly over to Anna Nyberg, and I'll introduce her in a minute, but just let me say a few housekeeping matters. I'm sure you all dab hands, as it were, at Zoom by now, aren't we all? But just to remind you, please to keep yourselves muted, really important if you wouldn't mind. Let's put questions and comments in the chat, if you wouldn't mind typing them in the first instance. And I would really appreciate it if you could direct them. I don't know if you can scroll down, yes, not to everyone, but to me, to Monica Bohm-Duchin, so that actually Anna and John don't get distracted by the questions, because I'll be the one fielding the moderating the Q&A. So please try and remember to do that. You've probably already realized that the event is being recorded, and the recording will be uploaded in the next week or so on the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel, which you might like to investigate for yourselves if you're not familiar with it. I think that's probably all we need for the moment by way of introduction to the sort of practicalities. So it's now my great pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. Anna Nyberg. She's an honorary lecturer at Imperial College London, where she's taught languages for many years, 30 years or thereabouts. She's an important committee member of the Research Centre for German and Austrian Exile Studies, which is indeed part of the University of London, and also a recent but much valued trustee of the Insiders Outsiders Arts Foundation. And I have to say, she's always coming up with wonderful new ideas for events in the future, which I hugely appreciate. She's also the author of a biography of the emigre artist Helmut Weissenborn. She's written a wonderful book on the emigre contribution to British art publishing, and another one on more recently, on the refugees' contribution to the British fashion world. Two of her essays have appeared in the companion volume to the Insiders Outsiders project, with a slightly long-winded title, Insiders Outsiders, Refugees from Nazi Europe and their contribution to British visual culture. And she's also co-produced an excellent film about refugee designers called Refuge Britain. And I should just add that if you go to the homepage of the Insiders Outsiders Festival.org website, you'll see there is actually a 20% off the Insiders Outsiders book if you're interested in finding out more about that. And I will tell you more, please don't let me forget that there is also a discount available on John Hilary's wonderful book, which we'll be hearing more about. So I think without further ado, and with great pleasure, let me hand over to Anna Nyberg.
Well, thank you very much, Monica. I feel like I have more introduction than I'm allowed, but anyway, here we are. Yes, John Hilary, it's my great pleasure to introduce him. He happens to be a neighbour, and he's become a colleague. We have shared research interests and a friend. He has published widely on global trade and other international issues throughout a career in the non-governmental sector, rising to become executive director of the charity War on Want, before moving on to work in Parliament. He's an honorary professor at the School of Politics and International Relations at the University of Nottingham, and is one of the Messel family representatives on the National Trust Advisory Board for Nymans. His entries on 3 members of the Messel family were published by the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography in 2019. And his latest book, which Monica has mentioned, is called From Refugees to Royalty, The Remarkable Story of the Messel Family of Nymans. It was published in 2021, and he's currently researching the cultural history of German Jewish art collectors in Britain during the Edwardian era. I have to say, I have read the book. It's absolutely wonderful, not only fascinating, but also beautiful to look at. I've also heard John speak at an event with the Ben-Uri Gallery, and tonight he's going to be speaking on yet another aspect of this fascinating family, the Messels. Over to you, John.
Thank you so much, Anna, and I'll just start by sharing my screen. And if you can just confirm that it is okay and visible.
That's all absolutely fine, John.
Super. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be able to give this presentation. I'm very pleased to be able to talk about the Messels at war, obviously in the context of Remembrance Day tomorrow, and also our commemoration of Kristallnacht, both yesterday and today. And I was going to look at 5 different responses to conflict during the 20th century, using the Messels as a prism, but also expanding it a little bit to look at broader German Jewish responses at the same time. And I'm particularly thrilled to be delivering this presentation as part of the Insiders Outsiders project, because the Messels really exemplify the story of outsiders who became the ultimate insiders. And indeed, the title I gave to my book, From Refugees to Royalty, charts that journey from when they were exiled from their original home in northwest Germany. They came down to the village of Messel, which gave them safe haven and from which they took their name, and then came over to Britain and became the ultimate insiders when Tony Armstrong-Jones married Princess Margaret, the Queen's sister, and their child, their first child, the youngest Messel of the time, became the 5th in line to the throne. But I think what's particularly fascinating about this focus on war and the responses to conflict is that it's in the context of war that the tensions between being an insider and an outsider really come to the fore. And that brings me to the first of my responses, which is conflicted loyalties. And this speaks to the first generation of the Messels to come over to Britain. This is my great-great-grandfather, Ludwig Messel, who, as you can see, was born in Darmstadt to a very successful Jewish family. He came over to Britain in 1865 at the age of just 18 and worked his way up to become a very successful stockbroker. He founded his own stockbroking firm and indeed became so prosperous that by the end of the 19th century, people were saying that he was perhaps the richest man on the London Stock Exchange. And he bought the country house of Nymans in West Sussex, which today, of course, is a very famous and very popular National Trust property. You can see it here in the early lithograph of the 19th century, pretty much exactly as it looked when Ludwig bought it in 1890. A pretty Regency house, which already shows on the lawn the beginnings of the garden for which Nymans is famous today. But Ludwig and his wife Annie, who was actually of a Christian and English background, they soon felt that they wanted to expand the house. And Ludwig asked his brother, the architect Alfred Messel, who was a very celebrated architect in Germany, in fact, chief architect to the Kaiser at the beginning of the 20th century. Ludwig asked his brother to design this extension for him explicitly in a continental style. And this is the design that Alfred came up with. Quite a sort of strange thing to put on the side of a Regency house. You can see that Renaissance style tower with a very Germanic octagon right at the top. And then in front, this alpine chalet effect, which would push out into the front lawn. And when it was actually realized and put in place, it was slightly changed and slightly altered in the building. But it created this very large house with a Germanic flavor to it. And if you see the conservatories on the near side of the house, these had become very grand because it represented the horticultural experiments that the Messels were engaged in at the time as their passport into society. But even as they were integrating into British society, this was the moment that relations between Germany and Britain were deteriorating substantially. And particularly at the beginning of the 20th century, people began to look at Germany as a genuine threat, not just to Britain's imperial power, but also actually to the integrity of Britain itself. And you began to see the beginnings of what became an invasion literature, books written about the prospect of Germany invading Britain. And in 1903, this book by Erskine Childers, The Riddle of the Sands, caused a sensation because it talked about the discovery of a latent plot on the German part to invade Britain. And if anybody hasn't seen the 1970s film of the book, starring Michael York and Jenny Agutter and Simon McCorkindale, I very much recommend it. It's free and available on YouTube. 3 years later, in 1906, William Le Queux published a blockbuster called The Invasion of 1910, which was serialized in the Daily Mail, and you could buy charts which would show you the projected journey of the Germans when they invaded, where they were going to go first and where they were going to go on to after that. But the real blockbuster, which William Le Queux published just 3 years later in 1909, was his book Spies of the Kaiser. And this purported to unveil a network of spies already active in Britain, feeding information back to Berlin in order to prepare for the invasion to come. And it sparked off a spy mania across the country, where people started informing the government about almost every German butcher, baker, or waiter they came across as a potential spy. And indeed, from that redeveloped Nymans, which we saw just a few moments ago, the tower which Ludwig had built was suddenly seen as potentially a spy tower. And locals began to spread rumors that Ludwig himself was a spy feeding back information to the Kaiser in Berlin from that spy tower. It's not really clear what they would have been spying on, given this is just rural Sussex and not particularly of interest to the German high command. But this was a period where it became more and more difficult for German Jews, and indeed anybody of German origin, living in Britain. And when the First World War broke out, this anti-German feeling really reached new heights. You can see here that the Anti-German Union was one of the groups which was formed in order to turn against not German nationals necessarily, because most of them had either gone back to Germany at the beginning of the war or indeed been interned, but German-born British nationals, so people who had been born in Germany or Austria and who had taken British nationality. And the anger against them reached new heights after the sinking of the SS Lusitania, which was a passenger liner carrying non-combatants, which was sunk by a German U-boat and went down very quickly with the loss of over 1,100 lives, many of them women and children. And this act sparked outrage across the world, and particularly in Britain. And you saw great mobs of people in the streets, starting with Liverpool, then Manchester, and then down to London. This is in Poplar. And any German or Austrian shop was ransacked and all of the contents thrown out onto the streets. You can see this is a Schoenfeld, the tobacconist in East London. And the press egged on this rioting and really took the side of the people who were saying this is time to clear out German-born nationals who are still in Britain. And the call came out, particularly to the more high-profile Germans, that they should now declare whose side they were on. Are you actually going to come out and say that you deplore the action of the German military? And many of them did. Many of the high-profile Germans and German Jews among them did come out. They sent letters to the Times saying, we absolutely stand by our loyalty to the king and to the country where we live. But at the same time, it was absolutely clear that they were very conflicted. As one of the German Jewish bankers at the time, Sami Jaffet, said, yes, I am loyal to the king, but I'm also deeply, deeply attached to Germany, which is the country of my birth. It's the country where my relatives live, where my dead are buried, where I made all of my first experiences, and where I still draw a lot of my cultural influences. So it was a very hard time for Germans living in Britain, but particularly when, like the Messel family, they knew that they had cousins who were in the German army fighting against the British. And this is the tombstone of the son of Alfred Messel, who was killed, as you can see, on the Western Front on the 30th of May, 1918. Gefreiter is the German rank, more or less equivalent to Lance Corporal. And it meant that the time of the First World War was a horribly stressful and anxious time for the Messel family. And Ludwig Messel himself died a broken man in 1915 as he saw his native country and indeed members of his family fighting against his adopted country, Britain. That brings me on to the second of the 5 responses to conflict that I wanted to cover, and it takes us to the next generation. And it's more of a straightforward patriotism, but mixed with a sensibility and an awareness of the horrors of war. And this is in the person of Leonard Messel, who is the elder son of Ludwig Messel. Ludwig, the original founder of the family in Britain, was very German. When he spoke, he obviously had a German accent, and you would immediately see that he was an alien presence. Leonard, shown here in his military uniform and mounted, was a quintessential English gentleman. He'd gone to Eton, he went to Oxford, and indeed he enlisted as a volunteer as a young man in the Royal Sussex Volunteers. You can see him in the front row, second from the left, sitting up very straight backed and looking proudly out at the camera. And he spent over 20 years in the Royal Sussex Volunteers and was awarded the Territorial Decoration by George V for long service. And when the First World War broke out, he was immediately asked to be the recruiting agent for the Balcombe district in West Sussex. But then soon after that, he was moved over to be the commanding officer of one of the training camps for soldiers of the East Kent Regiment, in fact, called the Buffs, on their way out to fight in France, in Flanders, and further afield. And again, you can see him here proudly sitting in the very center of the front row, showing how important this military service was, even though he himself never saw service overseas. And for his work as the commanding officer of the Buffs training camp, he was awarded the OBE after the war. His wife, Maud Messel, who you can see here, I've put her name under her, she's sitting in the front row in the dark uniform. She was the commandant of one of the voluntary hospitals in Balcombe in West Sussex, dealing with wounded men from the forces. And she also was awarded the MBE at the end of the war for her services. And Leonard and Maud inherited Nymans, the building as it had been enlarged by Ludwig Messel during the First World War. But really, they wanted to put their identity as a German Jewish family behind them. And so during the 1920s, they embarked on this enormous program of pulling down the German-looking building and in its place, putting up this extraordinary 15th century manor house built in the 1920s, a pastiche of the early English manor house, but actually built up of stone and of other fixtures and fittings which had been taken from genuine old English manor houses around the country. And this they filled with their English furniture, armor, and other collections. And of course, it's this building which forms the ruins of Nymans as they are today, the National Trust property, because the whole thing was burnt down in 1947 in this fire, which destroyed all of the central the central rooms. And what this says is that for Leonard Messel, his military identity was absolutely central to him throughout his life. He was always called the colonel in the local community, and he was allowed to wear formal ceremonial dress on all occasions where he needed to in the future, like here in 1936 when he was High Sheriff of Sussex. But it's important, I think, for us not to see him just as a two-dimensional Colonel Blimp type figure who was just a sort of patriot through and through. He was also a very sensitive man, and he was very aware of the horrors and the costs of war, as is shown in this extraordinary collection of letters that he preserved from hundreds of the men who went through his care as the commanding officer of the East Kent Regiment camp. And after the war, he had these letters typed up and bound and copies made, one of which is in the Imperial War Museum, another of which is at Nymans. And they're very moving, telling of the love, really, between him and the soldiers who he sent out, often to their deaths. This awareness of the horrors of war really forms the background for the third response I want to look at, of an active pacifism. And this comes again through the next generation. And it's on the side of the family, the brother of Leonard Messel, his younger brother Harold, who also had served in the Royal Sussex Volunteers for a few years only. And then at the beginning of the First World War, he also enlisted, in his case, in the Royal Sussex Regiment. And he had married an American woman called Leonora Messel. She was always known as Noni. And as you can see from her dates, Noni Messel was indirectly also a casualty of the First World War. Harold and Noni had had 2 children already before the war, and she became pregnant towards the end of the war with a 3rd child. And unfortunately, there were complications with the pregnancy, and her gynecologist was called away to serve as a doctor at the front. And so there wasn't sufficient medical expertise available to help her through the last stages of the pregnancy. And she tragically died in childbirth, giving birth to a stillborn son in 1918. And this was devastating for Harold, who already suffered from mental health problems, and 2 years later, unable to cope with the effects of this tragedy, he shot himself through the heart, thus orphaning the 2 children that they'd already had. One of them, my grandmother, Phoebe Messel, and the other one, her brother, Rudolf Messel. And it was really, I think, as a result of this double tragedy that Rudolf Messel became a committed anti-war activist throughout his life. He was also very involved in left-wing politics, and he formed the Socialist Film Council during the 1930s, one of whose films was this extraordinary anti-war film called Blow, Bugles, Blow, brought out in 1934. And Rudolf himself took a part in it. You can see him there at the back with the dark hair on the right-hand side. And this was a challenging film for the times. In fact, the censor refused it a certificate because it was considered to be too subversive. The story of the film is that the workers and soldiers rise up and refuse to take part in another war, and instead they overthrow the government, and you can see the red flag flying from Downing Street to the strains of the communist hymn, the Internationale. And Rudolf continued to finance with his wealth other socialist and anti-war projects, educational projects in the years that followed, including this monthly publication called Fact, which was brought out as part of this socialist and anti-war education. And it was about 100 pages long. It featured these very important essays on various different aspects of the socialist or anti-war project. And you can see in the middle one on Japan's war on China, next to it in the light blue, the underground struggle in Germany, which is about resistance to Hitler at the time. And indeed, they published Hemingway's long essay on the Spanish Civil War. But the real crux of the work which Rudolf undertook during the 1930s was his work on behalf of refugees fleeing the Nazi regime. And in particular, he was put in charge of supporting this really amazing settlement that was created high up in the Andes near the town of Popayan in Colombia. And this map, which you see here on the left, is the front cover of a fundraising appeal which Rudolf wrote on behalf of the colony in order to try to raise more funds to enable more settlers to go out there. And the settlers were both Jewish and non-Jewish victims of the Nazi regime. And it continued all the way through the war, providing that safe haven for them until the situation in the rest of the world continued to improve. And Rudolf himself actually traveled out to Colombia and worked on the settlement with them. You can see him here clearing some of the land, and he published his experiences in a book called Refuge in the Andes when he came back. But this focus on the refugee issue and the fortunes of refugees during that period of the 1930s and then into the Second World War came much closer to home for the Messel family because they still had cousins in Germany who at this point were being identified as German Jews. And in particular, the surviving daughter of Alfred Messel, the architect, Irene Messel, who you can see here in a photograph from the 1920s with her daughter Ina. Irene had been brought up in the Christian faith. Her father had converted, and she was known to her Messel cousins because she'd come over and visited Nymans when she was a child. She married Wolfgang Bruck, who you can see here, also from a German Jewish family, but also a family who had converted. And he, as you can see from his uniform, had served in the First World War as part of the German army. He'd served on the Eastern Front in Russia, and you can see in his tunic buttonhole, the band of the black with the white borders is the Iron Cross for valor. And lower down on his tunic, you can see the Stahlhelm, the steel helmet, which indicates that he was wounded in combat. And as I say, both of them were brought up as Christians, but under the Nazis' 1935 Nuremberg laws, they were identified as Volljuden, as fully Jewish, as a result of having 3 or more Jewish grandparents. And as such, they became more and more open to persecution from the Nazis as the 1930s progressed. And Irene came over to Britain. She came to Nymans in 1936, and she spoke with her English cousins about the prospect of providing support for her, for Wolfgang and their 2 children, Ina and Harro, to escape Nazi persecution if the situation continued to deteriorate, which of course it did. And with their cousins in Britain acting as sponsors for them, they were able to escape Berlin in 1939. They arrived in Britain just 4 months before the start of the Second World War. And the fate that they escaped is shown all too clearly in the case of Wolfgang's own family. He came from the Bruck family and took on the name of Messel, which there was a double-barreled name which they both actually used for the rest of their lives. But his father, Dr. Wilhelm Bruck, had been a distinguished appeal court judge in Kiel, and he had stayed in Germany together with his wife and together with their daughter, Wolfgang's sister Vera, they stayed because also they had been led to believe that people who served in the First World War, as Dr. Wilhelm Bruck had, in the same way as Wolfgang did, that they would be exempt from the persecution that the Jews were suffering. And clearly this was shown to be untrue, and gradually they were exposed to more and more persecution, until in the end, Vera, his sister, received a deportation notice to Theresienstadt, which was by that time little more than a staging post on the way to Auschwitz. And in order to prevent the family from being separated, both father, mother, and daughter committed suicide together on the 9th of July, 1942. And these brass cobblestones, Stolpersteine, stand now on the pavement in front of their house as a memorial to them. Irene and Wolfgang Bruck-Messel and their two children managed to make a new life for themselves, to begin with in Kent, and they settled in the little town of New Romney, which they said they found very sleepy after the Berlin of the 1920s and 1930s. And to begin with, they were able to circulate freely. The children went to school and Wolfgang could look for work, because they were categorized at the time as victims of Nazi oppression and therefore were not seen in any way as being a threat. But in May 1940, as the German forces swept through the Low Countries and occupied the north of France, and then when the British were forced out and you had the evacuation from Dunkirk, there was a great sense in which an invasion by the Germans of Britain was a genuine prospect and possibility. And at that time, Winston Churchill took over as Prime Minister, and he issued this call which said that this is no time to be allowing enemy aliens, so people of German birth, to wander around, irrespective of whether they're considered a threat or not. And he issued this edict, which said, collar the lot. And so a great many, I mean, the majority of German Jewish men living in Britain at that time, even though they had just been admitted as refugees, they were rounded up and interned, the great majority of them on the Isle of Man. And Wolfgang Bruck-Messel was one of those who saw his liberty taken away, and he was put behind barbed wire for 4 months until there was a great outcry in the country that this was a ridiculous policy, and people were released from their internment. And it was obviously a very traumatic experience for a lot of the German Jews in particular who were put behind barbed wire again, especially if they had already been in a concentration camp in Germany. The renewed experience of finding themselves in captivity was incredibly problematic for many of them. When I spoke to Wolfgang Bruck-Messel's son, Harro, in 2015, and I asked him what Wolfgang's impression and experience had been like, and what indeed the family had felt about seeing him put into captivity, Harro was very philosophical, and he said, actually, the family is full of great gratitude at their good fortune, at the fact that Wolfgang was not one of the internees chosen to be on the boat, the Arandora Star, which was sent across to Canada, carrying hundreds of internees and sunk by a German U-boat on the way. So it was a philosophical response, perhaps, to a very unpleasant situation at the time. After the war, the family moved to Apsley House, eventually in the Finchley Road. And of course, Finchley Road, as many of you will know, was a magnet for German Jews at the time, to such an extent that the bus drivers, when they were coming up to the stops, would call out Finchley Strasse instead of Finchley Road, to reflect the fact that there were so many German Jews and other Germans living there. And indeed, Finchley-Strasse was the name given to one of the Ben-Uri exhibitions a few years ago on German artists in exile at that time. And the Ben-Uri Gallery, when they mounted their annual exhibitions of contemporary Jewish artists, Wolfgang Bruckmessel himself was shown, because he was himself a painter as well as a designer. His work was shown in 1945, 1946, and 1947, alongside artists like Alfred Wollmark or Erna Auerbach, and indeed Jacob Epstein as well. And I think it's interesting to look at paintings by Wolfgang Bruckmessel, like these sunflowers. You can really see something of Jacob Epstein's floral studies in that painting as well. But as I say, Wolfgang was primarily a designer of internal decorations and of textiles. And here are three of the designs that he made in the 1950s, which are preserved in the Victoria and Albert Museum. And they show so clearly how this generation of German Jewish creative artists revolutionized a lot of the design practice in Britain after the war. And it speaks exactly to the chapters in the Insiders, Outsiders book that Monica was talking about at the beginning, and indeed to the work that Anna published in her book, The Clothes on Our Backs, talking about the modern designs which these German Jews brought in the period after the Second World War. And it's that theme of art taking us beyond war, which is the fifth and final response that I want to look at in this presentation. And it takes us to perhaps the most well-known of the Messel family in Britain, the stage designer Oliver Messel, who really in that period from the 1920s all the way through to the 1960s was the premier stage designer in the country and indeed internationally. This picture, which I'm very grateful to the University of Bristol Theatre Collection for allowing me to use this picture. They have the Oliver Messel archive. It shows Oliver in the Royal Engineers. He enlisted in the Second World War, and he joined the camouflage unit, and indeed was really quite an influential figure in the camouflage unit during those years. As already mentioned, from 1940 onwards, there was this great fear that Britain could indeed be invaded by the German army, and camouflage was seen as an integral part of the defences that we could throw up. And Oliver was stationed initially down in Somerset to form this line of defences called the Taunton Stop Line, made up of pillboxes and other emplacements. And his job was to camouflage those defences so they wouldn't automatically be recognisable by the Germans if they swept in from the west. And we've got a wonderful picture of one of the pillboxes that he did design at the time. He's designed it, as you can see here, as a gypsy caravan or something of the sort. And this comes from a book written by Julian Trevelyan, the artist, who was also active in the camouflage unit down in Somerset and took over from Oliver, and he preserved this picture for us. And camouflage had already been known from the First World War as an important part of the strategic equipment of an army, particularly in the field. And Solomon J. Solomon, who was only the second Jewish full Royal Academician, he published this guide to strategic camouflage in the field in 1920. But in the Second World War, it was also seen very much as part of the home defences, and this and it really sort of it elevated camouflage into an art form, as you can see by the manual which Roland Penrose wrote for the Home Guard here. And Roland Penrose indeed served with Oliver in Norfolk. They went to Norwich and created the School of Camouflage there. Roland Penrose, also quite well known to many people as having been active in trying to get artists out of Nazi Germany through the Artist Refugee Committee and bring them over to Britain. But if camouflage was an obvious way in which artists could contribute to the war effort, maybe the even more important work that Oliver was involved in was in terms of building and sustaining civilian morale. And even from the early days, he was responsible for the set and the costumes on this Technicolor extravaganza of The Thief of Baghdad, directed by Alexander Korda, of course, himself a Hungarian Jew. And this fantasy film, full of color and imagination, was shown in the cinemas in Britain at the height of the Blitz. So you can imagine people in London going into the cinema and having the escape of being able to luxuriate in these extraordinary costumes and the escapism, the fantasy of that world, even as the bombs of the Luftwaffe were falling about amongst them. But then at the end, oh, and I should also mention that that also is a film that you can see on YouTube, and I thoroughly recommend it if you have the chance to have a little look at it. And at the end of the Second World War, Oliver was released from his military service so that he could go and work as the set designer and costume designer for Caesar and Cleopatra, another absolute blockbuster which featured Vivian Leigh, as you can see there, as Cleopatra, and a young Stuart Granger looking very dashing on the left as Apollodorus. And this represented a moment, I think, for the country coming out of the drab, the horrible years of the Second World War, suddenly to see another of these Technicolor productions, which gave them that escapism and a sense of color in place of all of the horrors that they'd experienced. But the real moment, the crucial moment at which British culture and British life was reborn after the Second World War was in the staging of The Sleeping Beauty at Covent Garden by the Sadler's Wells Ballet under Ninette de Valois. And the costumes and the scenery again were put in the hands of Oliver Messel. And I think it's rather funny. You can see here on the poster that the music by Tchaikovsky is in a smaller print, to the importance of the costumes and scenery being by Oliver Messel. And the premiere of this performance, of this production of The Sleeping Beauty, took place on the 20th of February 1946. And this was the moment at which the country was reborn after the horrible years of the Second World War. And it was seen as a dramatic moment. The entire royal family attended the premiere, all foreign dignitaries came, anybody connected with the arts in Britain came along. And it was the moment at which you could see that the world was reborn with the fantasy world that Oliver was able to create in front of them. And what's particularly poignant and positive, I think, is that this is an instance of Isaiah's prophecy of turning swords into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks, because of course 1946 is right at the height of rationing. There were none of the materials available that you needed in order to be able to make a production like this a reality. And so what Oliver did is he turned to all of the old army stores that he'd known, and he used the canvas, an army canvas, in order to have the backdrops. He used camouflage paint in order to paint the scenery, and he used parachute silk to create the dresses for the ballerinas. And I'm really pleased to say that the Royal Opera House has recognized the importance of this Messel production, as it's called, and it is going to be reviving it again in the next 6 months. So from January to June of 2023, people are going to be able to see again the costumes and the set designed by Oliver Messel, and tickets are available as of now on the Covent Garden website or from the box office. And really, this is a perfect place, I think, to draw this presentation to a close, because it shows that after all of the horrors of war and the losses and the sorrows, there is still a place for art to be able to create beauty and a hope for the future. And so it's on that note, that positive note, that I will close the presentation. And thank you so much for listening.
So, John, if I can just intervene here, would you like to stop screen sharing, and then we should hand over to Anna to perhaps set the ball rolling with some questions. Go ahead, Anna.
Oh, I haven't got the chat function, Monica. Can you see it?
Oh, no. I just wondered if you had any questions that you'd like to start off with. You no obligation.
No, just absolutely wonderful. I'm letting it all sink in. I mean, there is a lot of work, isn't there, John, of Oliver Messel that one can still see. Interestingly, the Rosehill Theatre, I know, was built by another a Hungarian refugee in Cumbria. You know, all these very successful textile manufacturers were very cultivated people, but were slightly horrified by the fact that there were no opera houses or theatres. So Miki Sekkers just built his own in the back garden, Rosehill Theatre, which is still going today. And I know that Oliver Messel designed the whole interior for that.
That's right. And also Oliver linked up with Sekkers, I think, with designs on some of the textiles that Sekkers himself produced. So there's a very, very rich legacy across so many different disciplines there, which, yes, as you say, can still be seen. And you can even go and stay in the Dorchester at the Oliver Messel suite, although it does cost £5,000 a night. So I think you should keep it for special occasions.
No discount for insider outsider, unfortunately.
Probably not. I would urge anybody who has anything they'd like to add to the discussion here, questions, comments, etc., please to start typing in, or indeed, actually, if you want to raise your hand and ask the question yourself, that's absolutely fine. We have one coming in, but Andrew, if I may, I'd like to just sort of hold on yours for the moment and just ask a very basic question, taking us right back to the very beginning of this extraordinary family saga. Do we know what it was, and I'm sure there wasn't just one reason, but what it was that made Ludwig Messel in the 1860s actually make that change from Germany to this country?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really important question. And it's one which I've followed up in my most recent research, looking at other German Jewish migrants who came over at the time. They weren't, by and large, the poorest of the poor. Actually, from Germany at the time, the majority of migrants went across the Atlantic to the USA, and those were the poorer ones. In terms of the ones who came to Britain, it was often aspiring middle-class German Jews who found their progress blocked in Germany. There were distinct obstacles in the way of people reaching the top of various professions. And also, of course, London was seen at that time as absolutely the center of international finance. So if you worked in banking or any of the associated trades, London really was the place to be. And I think that's what drew Ludwig Messel over. There were personal issues in the family. His father had actually died young, and so the family bank, which he would have inherited in Darmstadt, had gone to an uncle. So I think that there were sort of pressures from that side as well. But I think, you know, it is fascinating for me to see in the memoirs and the autobiographies of a lot of the German Jews who came over at that time. There's a mix of the attraction of Britain as the center of empire and London as the center of finance, and also the desire to escape some of the daily indignities of anti-Semitism in Germany, which were rising through that period towards the end of the 19th century. But
just flipping the coin there, do we know if he encountered any anti-Semitic or indeed anti-German sentiment in this country when he first arrived?
There's certainly no record of
No.
that. I mean, he kept quite closely with partners from the Jewish community in Britain, although gradually he went on this journey away from his German Jewish roots, and he wanted very much to integrate his family into British society as soon as he can, which is why both his sons were sent to Eton. His 3 eldest daughters were all married to English men. So yeah, there's no evidence of that. One tiny thing comes up in the First World War, and I think this actually talks to Andrew Maunder's question in the chat, asking whether or not the Messels themselves faced any particular anti-German feeling during the war. And interestingly, the one example doesn't come from the press or from popular discontent. It comes from Oliver Messel at school, when his peers, other schoolboys, found out that the name Messel was a German name, and he was then bullied once they found out. And of course, this is quite an interesting thing, because a lot of Germans, whether Jewish or non-Jewish, changed their names, changed their surnames at that time precisely in order to be able to escape being stigmatized as German. And the Messels never did change their name. It wasn't an obviously German name in the same way as Saxe, Coburg, Gotha or Battenberg were obviously German names, but it was enough of a non-obviously British name to expose them to that type of attack. But the real people who got it in the neck during the First World War were the very high profile Germans and German Jews, as it happens. Sir Edgar Speyer, who was actually forced out of the country, and Sir Ernest Cassel, who also was targeted at that time.
Going back to the 19th century, it occurs to me there might be a parallel to be drawn between the Ludwig Messel experience and indeed the decisions, the reasons that he came here, and also William Rothenstein's family, because I think I'm right in saying they were prosperous textile merchants in Germany, middle class, affluent, but actually chose to come to what seemed to be the better prospects offered by this country. And then he is, initially extremely assimilated. His brother indeed does change his name to Rotherston. I think I'm right, aren't I? So anyway, just a thought there. Interesting. I can't believe there aren't any other questions. Please don't be shy. I've got a few more, if I may, perhaps just while people are, are thinking about what they might want to ask. This whole question of invasion literature, absolutely fascinating and really perturbing, to say the very least. It seems to, it's intriguing because this is this is essentially what, early 20th century, yeah?
Yes.
How does that tally or not tally with the fact that, after all, the British royal family has such close German connections?
Yes, no, it's extraordinary. And in fact, not just the royal family, that there were really close links in many parts of British society to the Germans, who were originally seen as our cousins. I mean, our antagonism traditionally had always been much more towards the French,
Exactly,
and a much greater sense of affinity with the Germans, and particularly, as you say, through the royal connection. I think you saw it begin to build, this antagonism, in the latter part of the 19th century, as people became more suspicious of German imperial designs, and the Kaiser himself was obviously seen as a bit of a menace in this respect. And at the time of the South African War, the Anglo-Boer War, the Germans very deliberately threw their lot in with the Boers and against the British, and this inflamed popular opinion. We have reports of British citizens sending letters of abuse to the Kaiser at his support of Kruger and the Boers against Britain. And then, as you saw, the Tirpitz plan, this plan for naval supremacy, where the Germans explicitly engaged in an arms race with the British Navy in order to try and challenge their control of the seas, that's when you began to see this antagonism really build. And the invasion literature was a reflection, I think, of how Germany was now seen, not just as an economic threat, but clearly German industrial development had really taken off and was challenging Britain in the end of the 19th century, but actually as a present threat, a much more immediate danger through its development of a naval capacity. And that's where you begin to see the invasion literature. And the spy mania is extraordinary. The spy mania was not helped by the fact that they did actually discover a whole lot of genuine spies who were rounded up in about 1911 and since then. And so, you know, people apparently were at absolute fever pitch. And this made it very, very difficult for Germans who found themselves stuck in Britain at the time. And you know, there are reports of Germans taking their own lives because it became so intolerable for them.
Fascinating, isn't it? I can't resist perhaps just adding at this juncture that on the Isle of Man, and I don't know whether, John, you've yourself been there, some of you may know, Insiders Outsiders joined forces with Jewish Renaissance just last year to organise a trip to the Isle of Man, where the main emphasis was indeed on the experience of the Hitler emigres, the refugees from Nazism, and their internment as so-called enemy aliens on that island. But actually, what I think a lot of people don't realise is there is another site. It's inland, it's sort of separate, as it were, as a tented camp called at Nokelo, which was a World War I site. And I don't know, John, whether you have been there, but this is a whole fascinating subject in itself, which I think far too few people know about. And I mustn't go on about it, but, you know, apparently there was even a Jewish section of the camp, you know, sort of acknowledgement of, you know, where there was kosher food served, you know, absolutely fascinating. So, and there's a very good sort of visitor centre, small museum there, which I would urge people perhaps to go and visit if they're interested in that aspect of things. Yes, and perhaps I should just also add to that, that on the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel, there are a whole number of events related to the internment experience, primarily in the Second World War, which I would urge you again, if you're, you know, you've had your interest piqued by what John has said, to take a look at. So, Anna, I don't know if you want to add anything. I mean, you've mentioned, you know, obviously Oliver Messel is a design historian, your particular interest. Did you, and this is moving away from the war theme, but I wondered if you'd like to tell people a little more about Oliver and his significance, perhaps?
No, I was just going to ask John, perhaps I ought to know, did the Brooke Messels all, they stayed in Britain, did they? And the son that you mentioned, was he born here or does he live here?
So the four of them came over in 1939, Irene and Wolfgang and their two children, Ena and Harro, who were both born in Berlin. And they stayed here, yes, all their lives. And Irene lived to be in her 90s. She was an amazing woman. She used to come to dinner with us in London. And there was a time after I had been living in Germany when my German was still quite good. And I spoke with her for ages after dinner when she sort of switched back into German and was telling me about life in Berlin in the 1920s and the 1930s. And it was an extraordinary view back into a very far off time. And then both of the children, Ena and Harro, stayed. Ena became a doctor. She was obviously very gifted and she wrote various papers for the Lancet, which you can still download. Harro himself became a professor in engineering in Swansea, and that's where I met him. He also lived into his 90s, and I met him shortly before he died a few years ago. An extraordinary man who really, he exuded this sense of gratitude. He said, there are 10 specific moments in my life for which I must be incredibly grateful. I think because he was looking at the comparative experience of so many others who didn't manage to escape the Nazi regime, who didn't have the fortune that his father had of being interned and then released. As he said, you know, my father could have been on that ship, the Arandora Star. And then there was other children who came from that, who kept the name Brooke and not the name Messel.
But indeed, yes. And also the Stolpersteiner that you showed us as well, all part of that family, and what happened if you hadn't made the move to Britain.
Yes, exactly.
Yes. Do you know where Wolfgang trained in design? It was
I don't know that, and actually it's proven quite hard to get much more information on his background like that. But certainly when he was here after the war, he would go back to Germany, to the Frankfurt fairs, and he worked for Sanderson's, the textile firm here, but also had his own company as a design company at the time. But I don't really know what the background is, I'm afraid.
No, that's very interesting. I can see in the audience there's Celia Frank there. Her father was also a German textile designer, also represented in the V&A. It's so interesting, isn't it? This sort of parallel stories. But the design history is particularly interesting to me because the refugees brought, modern techniques and all sorts of new ideas and new looks to Britain that we were very, very grateful for, especially in the post-war period. Lots of color and texture and completely different look. So he was part of that. And for me, yes, the training is very interesting.
Yes.
Also interesting, absolutely fascinating. I'm sure everybody will agree. Perhaps I can sort of begin to draw things to a close by asking you.
Monica, Celia just had her hand up there.
Oh, Celia, please go ahead. Sorry, this is the trouble with actually me not being able to see. Celia, please, you're unmuted. Go ahead. Let me spotlight you so people can.
Thank you very much.
There we are.
Fascinating talk. I wanted to actually ask about Tony Armstrong-Jones, and who you mentioned at the beginning, and is obviously a famous member of the family, and how you think that all this history has been distilled in him and the reactions to him when he was part of the royal family. Is that something you can say something about?
I think that's an absolutely fascinating question. It's something I tried to probe when I was doing the research for the book, and really trying to sort of draw out what was the reception, given that people knew about not just his German, but also his Jewish background, the family background. Obviously, to have a German marrying into the royal family wasn't anything particular, because the whole royal family was German and were very aware of their German roots. But the Jewishness, I think, was conveniently sort of forgotten. And it's an interesting point, of course, because there had been, from Edward VII onwards, this much greater acceptance of prominent German Jews in particular within the sphere of the royal family. I mean, Edward VII is well known for having kept what is sometimes referred to as a Jewish court, and having very, very good friendships with prominent German Jews who became part of his inner circle. And this is said in some respects to have opened the way to their presence in society at that time. Similarly, George V continued that to an extent. And so there wasn't, I think, an integral part of the royal family which would reject that. For Tony Armstrong-Jones himself, he obviously was by now a second or third generation Christian. So in a sense, he didn't bear a Jewish identity in any strong way. And in fact, a lot of the time he was very much more keen to articulate his Welsh identity. And when he died, he very conspicuously wasn't buried with the other Messels in Staplefield. He was buried over on the Menai Strait in Wales. So I think that, the Jewishness was really quite low down on their list of concerns. Whereas, of course, for others in high society, it wasn't that he was German or Jewish, it was the fact that he was a photographer, for goodness sake. How can a photographer possibly be marrying the Queen's sister? What have we come to, that we haven't got enough blue-blooded lords and dukes and viscounts who can step up and marry her instead? That was really the problem, much less about his family background. Unless you've come across something which I couldn't find.
No, No, not at all. But I think the outsider status, I mean, you absolutely right. The fact he was a commoner and a photographer, you know, tradesman virtually. But I would imagine that the very rich history you've described, you know, informed his art, and he was an outsider, you know, partly made him an outsider.
I wonder if I could actually ask a bigger question, very much on the back of what Celia has just asked you to comment on. You talked about this process of being outsiders who become, outsiders who become insiders. And one reason I put that kind of / in the title of my own baby, as it were, my project, Insiders, Outsiders, that it seems to me that actually to this day, and perhaps your own preoccupation with your extraordinary family history is a symptom of that, that actually that sense of being both an insider and an outsider simultaneously is actually what this is really all about. And I wonder whether you felt, you know, you obviously, there are others of your generation and perhaps, you know, younger ones besides, whether that sort of sense of otherness, or of, at the very least, of this extraordinarily rich insider-outsider history, you know, to what extent it's in the minds of a younger generation, or the present, you know, the present generation.
I think it's a really interesting question, trying to work out how long that outsider background is sustained from generation to generation is a fascinating one. I mean, what really for me has always been most I suppose an astonishment is when you see how quickly a German Jewish family could integrate and become part of high society. So Leonard Messel, in that very next generation, he was fluent in German, and he obviously was very aware of his roots, but he became almost more English than the English. He became, you know, lieutenant colonel, high sheriff, Lord Lieutenant, a prominent Freemason. And by the next generation after him, really there was very, very little mention of the fact that the family had been German Jewish. And certainly by the time it comes down to my generation, really we're not in any way conscious of having come from anywhere else. So when I was being brought up, there was no sense in which I felt an outsider status, even though I was conscious that we did have that that historical background. So yeah, it's interesting. I mean, certainly the interest value is very much there, but I don't know how long the awareness of an outsider status continues if the family has assimilated so fully.
And yet here you are, delving so fruitfully into that past. So this is a big open question, isn't it? Fascinating. Good. Well, I'm looking at the time, and I suspect people's tummies are rumbling and that it's time to draw things to a conclusion. Well, thank you so much, Anna. Thank you. And John, of course, above all. I think what was wonderful about this talk, for those of you who have read his book, is that actually it expands on things, topics, issues that you didn't have time to fully explore in the book. But if you're interested in the book, it is available. Now, was it a 20% discount, John? Remind me.
Well, I think a 30%.
Well, 30%, even better. And the way to do it is to contact Insiders Outsiders. You can go to the Contact Us section of our website. Again, just to remind you, Insiders Outsiders Festival.org, or you just do a Google search. And yes, contact us. It'll come through to me, and then I will forward your request to John, who will be able to send you the book. So that's certainly well worth taking advantage of. We've got a comment from Jackie Aldrich. Thank you once again for a most interesting and informative talk. Absolutely. Here. I'd like to just end by saying that, well, I've mentioned the internment sessions that are on record, quite literally, on our YouTube channel. The Finchley Strasse was mentioned, and I'd like to also mention that on the 23rd of this month is a talk by Pamela Howard, who was the creator of a wonderful, what can you call it? It's kind of piece of musical theatre called The Ballad of the Cosmo Cafe. And as many of you will know, that was very much where everybody congregated. And we have a recording of that on, again, the YouTube channel. And she's giving a talk in conversation with a kind of colleague and of hers called Pavel Dravik, to mark the publication of a memoir her memoir as a wonderful creative individual. So look out for that on the website. It was also in the newsletter. And perhaps most importantly, Anna herself will be reappearing quite soon as the introducer and chair of what promises to be a very interesting and quite different session to this, a sort of, you know, an indication of the range that Insiders Outsiders is trying to cover on next Wednesday. It's the 16th, is it not, Anna? At 6 o'clock. She's going to be in conversation with a gentleman very eminent in his own right, graphic designer called Ian McLaren, with a particular focus on the remarkable emigre graphic designers whom he encountered in the course of his illustrious career. So perhaps we'll see some of you there. Good. So it only remains for me to thank everybody for attending and to wish you all the best. And John, Anna, thank you very much again. All the best.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.